Thank you, Deborah, for that great introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with the Orange Audubon Society. I was telling Deborah and Kathy before everyone joined, I really love this format of these bird chats where we can all connect asynchronously, kind of regardless of our schedules, and talk about birds. So excited to be here tonight doing that very thing. And aside from kind of the boring stuff that Deborah mentioned in my intro, those of you who may know me or know me well know an obsessive birder, as I know that many of you all, and assume that many of you all are here tonight. And so I think that's kind of a logical starting place for a talk about eBird. And so I kind of want to begin tonight by having us think about, as birders, how do we learn about birds? How do we kind of accumulate the knowledge that we have about birds? And so obviously, probably the first resource that we all started with were field guides that are profiling, hundreds of thousands of species in a given region and provide detailed range maps and descriptions of field marks and illustrations that are oftentimes based on photographs if photographs aren't provided themselves. And all of this information is then, of course, or in many cases, kind of flowing out of the body of literature, published literature that exists on each of those species. And now, increasingly, birders are turning to identification softwares such as Merlin ID that we have in our pockets at any given time that are using kind of complex AI and machine learning enhanced, image recognition technologies trained on data sets that include hundreds of thousands of different photographs and recordings of bird species really all across the world. And so, these all seem like kind of disparate resources that the birders use, but what unites them is that they all kind of have a foundation in data and immense amounts of data. We're talking about millions of distributional, morphologic, and photographic or audiographic data points that go into the creation of each of these resources, which begs the question, right, of like, where does all of this data come from? And then kind of relatedly, how do we ensure that all of this data is actually usable for its intended scientific purposes? And so the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, in the creation of eBird, has kind of identified three characteristics of data that make it usable for scientific purposes. And those are salience, credibility, and legitimacy. And so the first of those characteristics, salience, which really refers kind of to the relevance of data for its intended uses. In the context of a lot of those resources we were just looking at, that really refers to kind of a spatial, temporal, and taxonomic completeness, meaning that that data kind of spans the full spectrum of geographic or seasonal or annual or genetic variability that exists both within a species and among species. And then kind of a secondary element to salience is open access, which simply means that the data is, the process of accessing that data is frictionless, it's barrier free. And this is really critical in a lot of kind of conservation science applications where traditionally, you have this large time lag between science and action that's created by the typical sequence of scientific problem solving, where you begin with problem identification, then you have to secure funding and permissioning to actually go out and investigate that problem. Then you have to, synthesize all of that data you've gathered into a, actionable solution, and then actually implement that solution. And that whole sequence of events is quite lengthy and time intensive. But if we already have data at our fingertips that can help us kind of elucidate these problems without us having to go out and investigate them, it really kind of compresses that timeline of scientific action and lets us respond to problems, or detect and respond to problems on a much shorter time span. So then kind of the second characteristic of scientifically usable data is credibility, which obviously seems quite, kind of self-apparent. Data has to be reasonably accurate and trustworthy for it to be scientifically robust. And then the third characteristic of scientifically usable data according to some of the minds at eBird and Cornell, is legitimacy, which can mean a couple of different things. It can mean that, obviously the data is collected in an ethical and reasonable way, but it can also mean too that data is collected in such a way to maximize its utility in a lot of different applications. And so you can think of a bird sighting that kind of exists in isolation. It doesn't, it really doesn't have much utility compared to a bird sighting that is time-stamped, that's georeferenced, meaning that it has all of this metadata attached to it about time, location, date, that can then be kind of made interoperable with other external data sets, such as data on habitat, or climate and weather and all this other stuff that we can then use to infer things like a species range of tolerance or a species habitat preferences, et cetera. And so, obviously, you probably know where I'm kind of going with this, which is that back in 2002, the prescient minds at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, they teamed up with the Audubon Society, the National Audubon Society, to create a database that essentially was designed to kind of crowdsource data from the millions of different, birders, bird enthusiasts, or even just casual naturalists with a general interest in birds into this database with the intent of that database informing scientific decision making, birding ID resources, and all sorts of different use cases that all kind of come back to benefit the users of that program. And of course, that program was eBird as we know it today. And so now, 20 plus years later, eBird has grown into the world's largest citizen science program, far surpassing a lot of other Cornell-linked citizen science programs that predated eBird and even continue today, such as Project Feeder Watch or the Great Backyard Bird Count. And eBird is even larger than other broad-reaching citizen science initiatives, such as iNaturalist, for example. And really, the way that eBird kind of was able to scale so rapidly and continues to scale very rapidly, which we'll touch on in a bit, is that it really kind of found a way to democratize data collection by converting millions of casual birders, people who don't have a formal scientific or ornithological background, into citizen scientists who could actually contribute usable scientific data. And so what it did is it crowdsourced data, all of our checklist submission data, when we're out in the field putting in the birds that we're seeing. It crowdsources all that data into a database that can then be used to map distributions and migrations and monitor population trends, inform conservation planning and habitat management, both within the private sector, but also in the public sector, and inform policy making and other kind of political decision making. And all of this is in the service or in service of the goal to make it easier for us to learn about and see birds. And so eBird has used all of our data to create a host of incredible tools that help all of us as birders kind of in this goal, make it easy to learn about and see birds. And so I'm going to quickly go through just a bit of that functionality. It would be impossible to spend 30 minutes or 45 minutes covering everything that eBird offers. It's truly just a incredible program. But I'll focus on a couple of kind of the more unique elements of functionality that at least I find interesting, and I think that you all will maybe get the most utility out of. So if we start on the eBird homepage here, if we're accessing eBird on a desktop or a laptop, we go up to the top navigation bar, go to the Explore tab. We're taken to this page where you see all of these different options, and all of what you're seeing here, excuse me, are what eBird calls raw data products, which essentially means this is where kind of our checklist submission data is going into the program. There's really minimal cleaning or kind of backend reconfiguration that goes on, and that data is then just put out to us in a variety of products. So it's not super sophisticated. But the products themselves are incredibly powerful. And so to give you an example of that, we'll first look at species maps here. So if we go into species maps, we can type in any species in the world. eBird, supports close to 11,000 different species, covering pretty much every species that has been documented on Earth. And we can, when we search a species in that search bar up top, you'll then come to a map that'll show you a scattering of pins all across your selected geographic region. And so in this case, we're looking at fulvous whistling duck in kind of the Central Florida region. You'll see this scattering of pins. Some are red, some are blue. Those red pins are pins that indicate a confirmed sighting of that species within the last month or so. And we'll get to what confirmed means shortly, as that's kind of a big focus of this presentation. But all of those red pins indicate validated sightings of fulvous whistling duck within the last month. All of those blue pins indicate more historical sightings of fulvous whistling ducks, or at least older than about a month. And we can click on any one of those pins and then see for that particular location all of the sightings of that species. So in this case, for fulvous whistling duck at Lake Apopka Wildlife Drive, which is a great place to see this species, by the way, you can see all of the observers who have reported fulvous whistling ducks there, the number of individuals they saw, the date that they saw the birds on, and if they had included field notes or photographs or recordings or any other sort of media or details, that would also be displayed there as well, which then you could go into the checklist to see for yourself. If we go back to the Explore homepage and go and look at a similar data product, in this case, Explore hotspots here, we see a kind of similar view with a lot of pins, but in this case, these pins are indicating birding locations that eBird has kind of designated as birding destinations where that are for the most part publicly accessible places where you can go and see birds. And here, the color scheme it's a color scale indicating the total number of species that has been seen at a particular hotspot, going from kind of an orange or deep red, indicating a really speciose hotspot with a lot of birds that have been seen there, to more blue, kind of lighter blues, which indicate that fewer birds have been seen there, perhaps just because it's a newer hotspot or it doesn't really get as much coverage as some of the more well-known areas. But if we click on any one of these places, for instance, Lake Apopka North Shore, you can see here that a total of 346 validated species have been reported at Lake Apopka North Shore across close to 4,500 checklists. And so Lake Apopka is, as many of you all probably know, being so nearby, one of the premier birding hotspots in the entire state of Florida, which owes a lot to the diversity of habitats it has there, but also kind of its latitude, where it's at the convergence zone of a lot of temperate species as well as kind of subtropical species. So you get some overlap in bird diversity there. Um, so those are just two examples of kind of raw data products that are more simplistic, you could say. But now we're going to go into what are called cleaned data products, meaning that this is taking our checklist submission data and putting it through a lot more cleaning, or you could say kind of reconfiguration to incorporate it into more sophisticated data products, all of which are still totally accessible to the general public or anyone who is, an eBird account holder. So if we go again to the top navigation bar, we go to science, we're taken to this page. We then scroll down a little bit, go to eBird status and trends over here at the left, and we go in here. We can then search for, again, a plethora of species, not quite as many as you can see in the raw data products. That's because for the clean data products, there isn't always enough data that has been submitted yet on all species out there. So for some species, they're unfortunately not profiled here yet, but eBird continues to add new ones on an annual or in some cases even monthly basis. But if you can put in a species in that search bar. For most North American species, they will be covered here. So we'll just use painted bunting. That's a good familiar one for most of us, I would assume and hope. And so when we go and look at painted bunting and we first go to the abundance tab up there in green, what you'll see is this range map, a very detailed range map, deriving entirely from our eBird submission data. And what this range map is depicting is relative abundance of painted buntings across their distribution. And the way that eBird is defining relative abundance, at least in this particular product, is the total number of individuals of that species that a reasonably competent observer, whatever that may mean, could see in a 1 hour outing that traverses about 2 kilometers of distance through, whatever habitat that may be. And so the darker colors indicate more relative abundance, meaning that hypothetical observer who's out there for an hour and 2 kilometers is going to more than likely see more individuals. Whereas those lighter colors indicate that fewer individuals would be seen on the same outing. And you can see over at the right-hand side that you can actually toggle these different little tabs here to look at relative abundance for any particular season. So we will look at winter here since it's winter for us, and we can zoom into peninsular Florida. And here's the view of where eBird is predicting that painted buntings are occurring across the state, or at least across peninsular Florida. And so you can see this distribution here. For those of you who are familiar with this species, it's probably not a terribly surprising map. You'll see the darkest blues, especially in Southeast Florida, as well as kind of the agricultural areas just south and around of Lake Okeechobee, and then also even Orlando area, you can see there's quite a bit of blue there and even extending up into Gainesville. And painted buntings are a species that do tend to prefer kind of disturbed habitats where there's more grasses and more early successional herbaceous plants that produce seeds that they like to forage on in the winter. So you can see just the incredible specificity that this map provides for mapping the distribution of painted buntings, far more sophisticated than what a lot of field guides even will show. And what's really cool, one of my favorite features of this particular data product is the ability to draw a polygon around any given region on the map. And eBird will generate a whole host of statistics about relative abundance and other things within that polygon. And so here we've drawn one around peninsular Florida, and you'll see over here at the right that then you have this little pop-up with all these statistics that appear. And so what this is showing in the blue is that in the state of Florida, eBird is predicting that close to 2% of the total painted bunting population is spending the winter in the state of Florida. Which, maybe that's surprising, maybe it's not. Painted buntings, they have kind of a bifurcated population where you have this disjunct Atlantic population and then a kind of Gulf and Midwestern population. That Western population in Texas and Oklahoma and those sort of states is significantly larger actually than our Atlantic population. And all of those birds or most of them are wintering down in Central America, from Mexico. They're really common in the Yucatan Peninsula, going down into Guatemala, Nicaragua, and I think, even down to Panama. So that's where the majority of painted buntings are. There are obviously some as well in the Caribbean. But we do have a number of them in Florida, and 2% might seem small, but when you think about the expansive wintering range that this species has, it actually kind of makes sense in a way. So it's really cool to do this with a whole bunch of species, and birds that we maybe perceive as super common here. If you look at it on a really zoomed out lens, they might actually be, the birds we're seeing here might represent just a fraction of their total global population, and eBird allows you to explore that in really exciting detail. Um, if I go here now to a different data product, still within status and trends, and we go to trends up there in the green button, here we're looking at a different species. We'll look at black-bellied whistling duck. And what you're seeing are all these little dots across the screen. Each of those dots represents a 27 by 27 kilometer kind of cube. And within that cube, which is a kind of imaginary cube. You're only seeing circles here or dots, but what those dots represent, or what the size of the dots represent, is the relative abundance of that species at that particular location. And then the color indicates the net change in relative abundance that has occurred since about 2012, or actually within the time frame of 2012 to 2022, so that decade-long period. Um, and so eBird is taking all of our checklist submission data and it's inferring the net change in abundance for these species at all of these different locations across their distribution. And so if we look at black-bellied whistling duck here, you'll note that you predominantly see kind of a sea of blue across most of their range. And what that is, or what that indicates, is black-bellied whistling ducks have experienced a significant range-wide, at least in the northern part of their range-wide increase in their numbers, which I think to many of us who have lived here since 2012 or even earlier, this probably wouldn't be very surprising. This is a increasingly very common bird. I mean, you see them from very wild, kind of undisturbed habitats to just your neighborhood retention pond and everywhere in between. That all of that is reflected in our eBird checklist data, and then all of that is going to be reflected here in this data product. Um, but if we now look at a slightly different case, a more depressing case, we'll look at eastern meadowlark, and instead of seeing a lot of blue, you're seeing a lot of red, and not only red, but very bold red, a lot of big red circles, and dark red circles at that, indicating a pretty sharp net decrease in relative abundance since 2012. And so meadowlarks, they're actually a species that has lost about 2.5% of their population on average since 1960. So they're in steep decline across their range, primarily owing to kind of post-industrial land use changes. So a lot of farmland has, kind of naturally reforested, which is benefiting some birds, but it's also hurting other birds that rely on kind of open field type habitats. And then, of course, you also have agriculture becoming more mechanized, and there's increased use of pesticides. There's, more frequent harvest rotations, all of which kind of disrupt the breeding ecology of the species. And so, eastern meadowlarks are in really rough shape, as are a lot of grassland birds, and really, actually, a lot of some of our most common birds in North America. You look them up here in the trends section, and you will see a sea of red. Species like American robin, for instance, which a lot of these species, because they are so common, they occupy such a diversity of habitats. You would expect that they'd be incredibly resilient to human disturbance and habitat alteration. And the fact that they are showing kind of the decline that they are, based again all on our eBird data, is incredibly alarming, and it only goes to show what more sensitive species are likely facing the predicament they're in. So now that you've seen, whoops, went ahead a little bit. Now that you've seen kind of all of the functionality that eBird has, and I shouldn't say all the functionality because we really just scratched the surface there. But you hopefully get a sense of the amount of data, the truly immense amount of data that has to go in to power all of that incredible stuff. But to really put some numbers to that, if we look at eBird on the global scale, there are currently about 1.2 million eBird users across the globe who have reported close to 11,000 different species across 120 million checklists. And in just 2025 alone, actually, eBird surpassed 2 billion bird sightings, which is just a mind-boggling number, completely unprecedented, really in kind of population, ecology in general. And that's just talking about eBird. But if you think also about the other universe of Cornell products, such as Merlin, for instance, Merlin has 33 million users, 10 million of whom joined in 2025 alone. So, both of these programs are just scaling at a near exponential rate or even more. Um, and so, all of that data that's been collected, it's going to great uses. Just in 2025, there were 200 different research papers that were published using eBird data, which brings the total body of literature derived from eBird data to, I believe, in the 2,000 to 3,000 range. Really, really impactful stuff. Um, we then progress here to look just at Florida. We'll see that there have been about 93,000 total eBirders reporting data from the state across 3.75 million checklists for a total of 575 species. This was as of at least earlier this month. Most of those numbers probably won't have changed that much, but it's cool to kind of watch it change throughout the year. And based on the data shown here, that put the state of Florida in third as far as the total number of species reported here, behind Texas and California. We're also quite up there in terms of total checklists submitted. I think we're also third there. And then eBirders were second in the ABA or in the United States as far as total number of eBirders who have submitted data from here. So we're doing well down here in Florida by eBird standards. Um, Now, you may be wondering, the way that eBird kind of achieved this incredible scale of data collection was by making it as easy as possible for anyone and everyone to sign up. There's no sort of test that you have to take before you get an eBird account. Your identification skills aren't validated in any sort of way. And so, on one hand, the fact that there aren't any barriers to entry for participation in this database is incredible, and it has brought so many new people to the world of birding that probably would never have had an introduction otherwise. Um, but at the same time, obviously, that openness and inclusivity also comes with the potential risk of data credibility, and the lack or potential lack of data credibility threatens to kind of damage or break that linkage that exists between eBird data collection and all of the various resources that rely on that data and take it as authoritative. Whether that be our field guides or Merlin or those science products that we just looked at that themselves are informing a whole body of published literature. And so the way that eBird kind of has came up with dealing with this credibility issue is that it put in place a two-part quality assurance / quality control procedure called eBird review. And that two-part process involves both automated and manual screening of eBird data to ensure that before it enters the public database and then flows to all of these other different uses and applications, it ensures that that data is reasonably credible according to the opinions of people who eBird has designated as, regional people who are quite knowledgeable about birds in a particular region. Um, and so now I'll go through what eBird review looks like from my standpoint, an eBird reviewer, and how that kind of translates into your experience if you're not an eBird reviewer but an eBird user. So really, anytime you go out eBirding, wherever you are, at any time of year, you pull out your phone, and you put in the location and you start, going through, doing your thing, put in the numbers, etc. You'll see that there's kind of a preset or pre-populated list of bird species that are appearing on your list or on your phone. And that list is going to fluctuate throughout the year, depending, both throughout the year and then also depending on where you are. And that list is actually the output of eBird reviewers like myself, who over here in eBird filters on the left-hand side of the screen are spending, hours basically kind of curating what species are expected to occur within a given place at a given time. And those filters are then reflected in that list of birds that you see on your phone when you're out eBirding. And so let's just go through an example of, what happens if you try and report something that is not included in the eBird filters for whatever reason. And the eBird filters, they start off as kind of it's manual entry, but it's a one-time manual entry for the most part. And then once those filters are established, it kind of serves as an automated screen on data that is being submitted to eBird thereafter. Obviously, the filters are tweaked and changed all the time, both as bird populations continue to kind of shift and change, such as, black-bellied whistling ducks becoming more common, or maybe eastern meadowlarks becoming less common. But for the most part, it's kind of a one-time investment in time to create those filters, and then after that, they are dynamic, but not to a crazy degree. So for the most part, it's pretty automated. But let's say, though, just to use an example, you're out birding at, say, Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge to your all's east in Brevard County, my north being down here in Indian River County, and you think you've seen a great white heron or the white subspecies of great blue heron, which is a subspecies or potentially species, but I won't go down that road. It's a subspecies for now that is uh, generally restricted to the Florida Keys, Cuba, Yucatan, and kind of some other places in the northwestern Caribbean. So this is a species or subspecies that really shouldn't be occurring in Florida, or excuse me, at least at our area of Florida, anywhere north of the Florida Keys. So you will not see that appear on the list of options when you're out birding at Merritt Island at any time of year. And so you can see here that in the filter, we've put in zero. So no great white herons are going to appear on your list at any time of year in Brevard County. So if you then want to add that species to your list, you have to kind of manually add it. It's not just going to appear there on its own. Now, a similar case would be too that let's say you're still out at Merritt Island and you see a very large number of white pelicans, and you estimate that there are, well over 1,000 white pelicans. This in this case, you will also see that eBird will flag that for you. You'll put a little warning sign here, just as it did with the great white heron. And that's again because the eBird reviewers in the filters over here have specified the maximum number of individuals of that species that are considered, the maximum number that would be considered kind of typical for that location. Um, and so, when you see a flag like this, when you're out eBirding and you do something that the program doesn't like, which is to say that the filters have screened as being potentially unusual and therefore potentially erroneous, the flag is not there to scare you. So don't fear the flag. It's there to basically make you just kind of pause and reflect. So for that great white heron, for instance, you see the flag, you should think, could that have been a great egret, a species that looks quite similar and would be far more expected than a great white heron. And then for the American white pelicans, it just forces you to think, maybe I should go back and try and estimate my numbers again, make sure that I was really methodical in how I arrived at that estimate, and that I'm not potentially double counting birds or overestimating in any way. So it just kind of it's an automated check that makes you that pause and reflect. But let's say you've done that. You've gone back through your white pelicans. You're confident in your total. You're confident in that great white heron actually being a great white heron and not just a weird great egret. And so eBird, before you try and submit that checklist, it's going to prompt you to include some field notes. And in fact, it'll require you to put in some notes of some sort. So you go ahead and do that. Then you click submit, and that checklist is off to the eBird database, except for those sightings that are flagged. And so what happens to those flagged sightings is they all accumulate in a big queue that reviewers like myself receive that we then kind of have to sift through and evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether or not the documentation provided for those flagged reports is sufficient for including that report in in eBird's public database that is accessible to the general and scientific community. And so this is the manual element of that two-part QA/QC process that eBird has implemented there. And so for any species that, or any flag report that appears in the review queue there, eBird reviewers are faced with two options. We can either accept that sighting or we can mark it unconfirmed. And so we will accept that sighting, or if we accept the sighting, what that means is then that data point is going to flow into the public eBird database. It's going to be used in all those raw data products we were looking at, as well as all of those clean data products we were looking at. And then from those clean data products, it can then be used in things like, field guides or Merlin or the body of literature that exists on that particular species. And so it'll go there as well as being kept in your personal records on eBird. But if instead we deem that the evidence provided to substantiate that sighting is insufficient to, conclusively establish the identification as correct and kind of warrant that, that sighting should be included in eBird's public scientific database. So if we mark it unconfirmed, what then happens is that the data point is excluded from eBird's database. But it's still going to remain in your personal records. So this is a question that eBird reviewers, get a lot: is, can they manipulate your records in somehow or in some way? And the answer is a definitive no. There is no way that any eBird reviewer, any sort of volunteer, or to my knowledge, most folks at eBird could ever go in and manipulate your personal records in any way. And this is, in general, a good thing. I mean, I think many of us, if we are active eBirders, we've been in situations where, we know the bird that we saw. We were very confident in our identification, but for whatever reason, maybe we weren't able to get, that much kind of evidentiary detail, or the reviewer just doesn't like us for some reason, and so they mark it unconfirmed. And so, we can rest assured, though, that that data point, it can remain on our checklist if we want to keep it there, and it's going to stay in our public records. So that's kind of a nice separation that eBird has created between their the public database, and then kind of the private personal database that is just accessible to eBird account holders. So now what I want to do is go through and actually show what it looks like to mark a sighting unconfirmed, and kind of explain why we might mark a sighting unconfirmed. And so when we go in to do this, we're prompted to provide a reason for why we have made this decision. And you can see that list over here on the left. There's a whole host of reasons here. I'll just highlight a couple of the ones that we see, that reviewers tend to see kind of recur most frequently. And the first of those is Merlin ID documentation inadequate. This is one that really irks a lot of reviewers. Understandably, even though birders, when they do this, they do it with the best of intentions. But basically, what often happens with a lot of newer eBirders is they love Merlin, understandably, and when Merlin detects or claims to detect a unusual bird, they basically all they will say in the species comments for that bird are confirmed with Merlin ID, or I didn't hear it, but Merlin picked it up, or something to that effect. And the unfortunate reality is that Merlin, as powerful of a tool as it is, it just isn't at a state yet where we can confidently say that its identifications are accurate. It still is very prone to errors, particularly with more unusual birds. And so, an eBird reviewer's recommendation would be to use Merlin, use its suggestions as just that, as suggestions that then kind of serve as the basis for further inquiry. So, Merlin suggests something that's unusual. You should try and make an effort to independently confirm that bird on your own, whether it be tracking it down to see what it is, or recording it and then going back and, doing some research to make sure that that recording actually matches the listed identification that Merlin is providing you. Because if you just put confirmed with Merlin ID, that sighting is in 99% of cases going to get marked unconfirmed and excluded from eBird's public database. Now, another example, and a very varied example of a reason why an eBird reviewer would mark your report unconfirmed, and this is frankly the most common reason, is documentation inadequate species. And so this can manifest in a whole kind of suite of ways. But some of the more common manifestations are what you see here. So someone reports an eastern kingbird, they simply say seen well, or they report a golden crowned kinglet and they say flitting through the trees above parking lot, with other songbirds. And the issue with this evidence is that it provides literally zero evidence that that identification was correct. It doesn't allow the reviewer to ascertain whether or not that bird is in fact what this observer claims to have seen. And I'll make a comment about seen well because that's something that you'd be surprised how often appears in a reviewer's review queue where people, when they get a flag sighting, that's all they say is seen well. And my response to this would be that eBird is it's only intended for birds that you were actually absolutely confident in the idea of. And so that would imply that, seeing well is kind of the minimum threshold that any bird that you list on your checklist needs to meet. So, putting that for a rare bird in particular, that's great, but all of your birds on the list should be seen well. And that doesn't, for a rare bird, that's not going to give much confidence that the identification is in fact correct there. Um, but now I'll look at a more kind of a more nuanced case. So here's an example where someone reports a greater scop, and they've included pretty detailed field notes, which I'll read out now. So this person says, adult male with greenish sheen to head and more rounded crown shape, bluish bill, black head and undertail coverts, white flanks, and pale grayish back also noted, seen with other diving ducks foraging in the middle of the lagoon. And so, in probably 60 to 70% of cases, this would be actually fantastic field notes. This person has noted the sex and age of the bird. They've provided a pretty detailed description of all of its main field marks. They've noted its behavior and its location. And all of this is, great. They've kind of ticked the boxes on pretty much everything a reviewer would be looking for to have confidence that the identification is correct. But now this is a case where if you're familiar with SCOP and SCOP ID, you'll know that greater SCOP and lesser SCOP can look strikingly similar and that SCOP ID can be quite nuanced. And so I'll show you as an example of that, this photograph at the lower left here. You'll see that this bird matches that description very well. The bird has a greenish sheen to the head. It has a rounded head as well. And those are traits that are traditionally associated with a drake adult male, or, an adult drake greater scop. But the reality is that lesser scop can also show these features, very frequently, actually. And in fact, this is a photograph here of a lesser scop. And so this is a case where the identification is so nuanced that more detail would have to be provided to really give the reviewer confidence that that this person was in fact seeing a greater scop and not potentially a lesser scop doing a good greater scop impression. And then here's kind of a similar example to that follow-up example. So this person is reporting a thick-billed vireo, which is a very rare vagrant from the Bahamas to southeast or primarily southeast Florida that occurs maybe once a year, maybe twice a year, generally a very, very rare bird. And so kind of like with the scop, this person did provide a lot of detail in their species comments, which I'll read out here. So this person said, seen for about 15 seconds deep in thick vegetation, roughly at eye level, this vireo immediately struck me as being off for white-eyed vireo based on its uniformly drab, less contrasty plumage with brownish yellow tones, not greenish. The eyes were also dark and the bill was very thick. After I got home, I consulted my field guide and confirmed the ID. The bird was too quick for a photo. So again, on its face, that looks like a pretty good description. But there are a couple errors here or a couple red flags, I should say, that a reviewer would likely pick up on. The first being that the observer notes that the bird was seen poorly and kind of in an obscured way. So obscured and poorly, in fact, and briefly, that they weren't able to get a photo, despite implying that they maybe had the ability to. So that's one potential red flag. And then kind of as a follow-up to that, despite the fact that the encounter was so brief and so poor, they were able to note a pretty surprising amount of detail here, including pretty fine, minute details such as iris color and bill thickness, and other things like that. And the next sentence after that kind of gives a clue as to why that may be, which is they say, after I got home, I consulted my field guide and confirmed the ID. And now this seems like a very logical approach. You see something in the field, you're not quite sure what it is. You go home, bust out that field guide and you look to see what kind of fits the bird you saw in the field. I think we've all probably done that in various situations. Or if it's not doing that, then it might be, nowadays you pull up your Sibley app or Merlin or whatever it might be to do the same thing in the field. But eBird is actually very explicit about this in their guidance for how to document rare birds. And they say, that you should not do this because what can often happen is, you kind of form this memory of what you saw in the field. You then go into a field guide and you're inundated with all of these different options. And you kind of, it's easy for your perception of what you actually saw in the field to get clouded by what you're seeing in front of you in that field guide. And then to kind of selectively pick, okay, well, this, maybe looks similar, this maybe looks similar, and then kind of write a description in your species comments that are, rather than being derived from your field experience, they're being derived from what you're seeing in the field guide. And so that is a particularly difficult situation for a reviewer to navigate when it's a species such as thick-billed vireo, which presents a really difficult ID situation in some cases. And so in this particular instance, thick-billed vireos can look very similar to juvenile white-eyed vireos. And in fact, that's what this image at the left shows. This is a young white-eyed vireo. And you can see that that bird in many ways matches the description that's provided here for the thick-billed vireo report. It's uniformly quite drab. It's not very contrasty. It's more brownish yellow, not really greenish as you would kind of associate with an adult white-eyed vireo. The eyes are also dark, whereas you think of a white-eyed vireo being white-eyed. And the bill is thick too. It really on its face kind of seems to align with thick-billed vireo, but in fact, that's actually a white-eyed vireo. And so this is again a case where not only is it a very nuanced ID, but it's also because it's such an exceptional rarity, this is a case where really photographs or audiographs or recordings, so photographic or audiographic evidence would be required for a reviewer to accept that sighting, unless the observer happens to be exceptionally skilled. But that's generally not a very common situation that we see, or it's something that we're inclined not to do, not to just assume that a ID is correct based on who the observer is necessarily. So I think now that we've kind of gone through that whole review process and seen how that basically is kind of the back end, or I should actually say the front end of all of the data that's going into the eBird database. I think it would be helpful to kind of leave you all tonight with a list of eBird tips to help you contribute scientifically valuable observations to this database. And so I'll start with the first one here, which should be quite obvious by now, which is that you should always document all sightings thoroughly, and when possible, include media with your observations. And so again, it should be self-apparent that you need to document your sightings as thoroughly as possible in the field, include field notes, take field notes in the field rather than retroactively after you've consulted ID resources. But the latter piece here about including media with your observations is especially important as well for a couple of reasons. Not only does that provide absolute certainty to a reviewer that your identification is correct, but the inclusion of media in your report is also helping a lot of different resources that we as birders rely heavily on. And so I'll give an example, which is Merlin is actually trained entirely off of the Macaulay Library, which is the data set or database of eBird photos and recordings that we're submitting. And so that Merlin uses what's called a convolutional neural network, a type of machine learning, to basically assess all of those images using image recognition software. It's looking at photographs. It's looking at visual representations of sound called spectrograms, which are basically charting the frequency of sounds over time. And it is kind of deducing patterns in all of these different things to then use that knowledge to recognize those same sounds and photos when they are being submitted by eBird users in the field or kind of after the fact. And so with Merlin, it actually takes about 150 different distinct images or recordings for Merlin to have confidence in a particular identification. And so Merlin is still continuing to add new birds to its list of identifiable species. There are a lot of birds out there that actually don't have 150 photographs or recordings. So Merlin, doesn't have enough data to include them yet in the data set. And so obviously photographs and recordings that you can get of those birds are great. But even for more common birds, it's really valuable to include photographs and recordings because for so many of those common birds, there is just incredible variability across, sex and age and season, both in terms of, plumage and kind of visual characteristics, but also in terms of vocalizations. And Merlin has to be able to kind of be trained and knowledgeable about that full suite of variability to be accurate in the field. So when you're contributing media, especially high quality media, you are playing an active role in improving the identification ability of that software, which I think is really cool. The second tip I'll share here is when in doubt about an ID, submit the bird as a non-specific taxon, which is to say something kind of above the species level. If we go back to that scop example or the vireo example, if you're not absolutely certain it was a greater scop or a lesser scop, depending on where you are, you can just submit it as greater/lesser scop. That's totally acceptable and very much encouraged by eBird. Same goes for that vireo. If you're not absolutely certain it was a thick-billed vireo, it's best to just report it as vireo species. And there are non-specific taxa like this that exist for pretty much every family group, every genus out there in eBird. In fact, if you have no idea what family or genus a bird represents, and you just know it's a bird, you can even just submit it as bird species. And so, eBird really wants you to make use of these options. They wouldn't exist if they weren't valuable. And again, you shouldn't be putting a bird on your list unless you're absolutely certain of what it is. And if you're not certain, that's when you use one of these examples, or one of these non-specific taxa, rather than just kind of making a guess as to what it might be. The third tip I'll provide here is use Merlin and other identification softwares. There are others that are coming out. Some that aren't even bird oriented. I mean, some of the AI tools are pretty darn sophisticated, believe it or not. But again, exercise caution. All of these softwares, as powerful as they are, they're still error prone. They're still not perfectly trained. They're going to make mistakes, especially for more unusual species. So be extra wary whenever Merlin is suggesting something that might, be a little bit unusual in your area. Fourth here, submit complete checklists whenever possible. This is one that is really important as far as much of eBird's data outputs. So most of the cleaned data products that we were looking at, such as within that science tab, such as status and trends, that's relying on only complete checklist data. Incomplete checklist data cannot be used for those products. And the reason is that those products are looking at the probability of species occurrence, and probability is both a function of the species that are occurring on your checklist, but just as equally the species that are not occurring on your checklist. And so when you are submitting a checklist, you are providing so much information, not only on what's there, but also what's not there. And that what's not there could actually be as important or more important than what is there in some cases. So when you submit complete checklists, you are providing that data. When you submit incomplete checklists, you're not, which means that data cannot be used in a lot of the scientific applications that flow from eBird data. So my recommendation here would be when you do feel inclined to submit an incidental list, let's say you're stopped in traffic at a red light and you look over in a ditch and there's a roseate spoonbill or a wood stork or something that, would warrant a list for you. Even if it's just taking a couple minutes and kind of looking around and noting what other birds are there in your vicinity that you can detect. Maybe it's some flyover vultures and starlings on the wire, or you hear a cardinal up at the car window, whatever it may be. Put all those down, and that way you can actually submit a complete list and make that list usable in eBird scientific data outputs. And then fifth, and finally here, avoid reporting X as the number of individuals for a given species when you're not able to get an accurate total. And I can empathize with the urge to do this in certain cases. I know that you can be in places such as, say, like Apopka Wildlife Drive, and you see what just seems like an overwhelming number of ringneck ducks or American coots or something like that. And it does seem awfully tempting to just put in that X there. Or another thing that, we sometimes see birders do is they'll just put in one as the total for everything on their list, indicating that they really made no effort to actually, get fairly accurate tallies. Especially when you report X, that notation is completely useless to eBird. It doesn't know how to interpret it, and that renders that eBird data, completely unusable for especially all of the clean data products that, again, are informing a lot of the scientific uses of this data. So, even when you're faced with an overwhelming number of individuals, it's always best to just try and make some sort of conservative estimate. You can kind of parcel out the flock into, tranches of, say, 100 birds or even 500 birds, and then kind of, in your field of view, replicate that tranche across the whole entire flock and actually get a pretty reasonable estimate. So, try and be intentional with how you do that when possible, because that'll just ensure that your data is actually being used for science. Um, and so that brings me more or less to the end of the talk. And so I think kind of the final message I'd like to leave you with here is, before taking questions, which I hope we have time for. I may have gone a little long here, which I apologize for. But eBird is it's kind of fundamentally reshaped our engagement with and our understanding of birds in a way that, I mean, I don't even think that the creators of eBird could have even imagined. It's just truly monumental. And so when we are intentional with how we use this incredible tool, and when we take care to make sure that the data we contribute is kind of hitting those three markers that Cornell is looking for: salience, credibility, and legitimacy, we're actually playing a direct part in kind of bolstering the utility of the very resources that we and other birders are depending on, whether that be the field guides we use or Merlin or scientific research. And the same is true of informing, policy and decision making aimed at protecting birds for us and the generations to come. And I think that last point is particularly salient in a world where, since 1970, the North American continent has lost 3 billion birds, billion with a B, due to human-induced environmental stress. And so if we can engage the most people possible through this app, through eBird, and make sure that we're contributing high-quality data, that's one way that we can all, each and every one of us, play a role in reversing that trend and giving birds a fighting chance in an increasingly challenging world by equipping scientists with the data they need to enact, actionable solutions. So with that, to mandate to use eBird and use it responsibly, I'd love to take any questions that you may have if we have time for that.
Terrific. Thank you. And everyone, you can turn your camera on, you can unmute yourself, you can type in the chat, however you want to do it.
Yeah, and we did have JT. Okay, sorry, I need better bifocals, I think. He did ask, of all the checklists submitted, what percent get through automated and manual reviews to be included in clean data?
That's a really good question. On one level, 100%, right? Because every time you open that eBird app to start submitting data, that list of species you see there it's filtered based on what the eBird reviewers have filtered as expected species for that area. So that's kind of the automated check. But in terms of, flag reports that then have to undergo the manual review, I don't quite have an answer for you that, or at least a definitive answer, but I would say probably, it would be very small. It would be probably 1% of the total eBird sightings that are submitted or are going through the review process. I mean, I can just speak from experience in my review regions, which, as Deborah mentioned at the beginning, span Indian River, Brevard, Volusia, Flagler, and St. Johns counties. If I go like a week without checking the review queue, I'll come back to probably 300 or 400 flag sightings, at least this time of year when there are a lot of birders down here. There are all the birding festivals going on. But that really, I mean, that reflects a fraction of the total number of bird sightings that are being reported to eBird. So it's actually pretty small. But again, those sightings that are flagged in many cases are of high interest to the scientific community. So it's important that we kind of put them through a series of screenings and checks to make sure that they're accurate.
All right, any other questions? Lori did say thank you, and Kathy said great presentation. Jay said, I think it would be helpful to let e-bidders know that the observations weren't accepted so they can improve their documentation. Does that happen?
Absolutely, 100%. And I really appreciate you bringing that up because it just occurred to me that I didn't even really touch on that. But the answer is totally yes. This does happen. It's kind of specific to each reviewer, but in my case, I try whenever I can to send out an email to someone when they haven't submitted enough documentation for a sighting, or it seems that maybe they've made a misidentification or there's some sort of other error, which we all are prone to at some time, reviewers or non-reviewers. But so the answer is yes from my standpoint. I'd say that on a daily basis, I send out probably 4 or 5 emails to folks, and that's partly because the regions I review have just a very high volume of birders who are submitting a lot of data that is flagged. But if you have received one of these emails, you'll either receive this very lengthy template that I really don't like, actually. eBird Review has this pre-made template that's super long and bulky, and it's kind of overwhelming and honestly kind of scary when you receive it. I remember being, younger, starting off and receiving that scary email, and you feel, like you've done something terrible. But I generally try and delete all that and kind of write a personalized message when I can, explaining, hey, just, like to see some more details here if you can provide them, or explain why maybe their report seems like a misidentification. That's generally specific to a reviewer, though. Some, they won't email, they'll just shoot out that template and you'll never hear back from them. But some of us, we're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of reports to go through, and we have other lives outside of volunteering for eBird, so it can sometimes be difficult to get to all of them.
Hey, Will, great presentation. This is Brennan. What are you most excited about for eBird in the future?
Good question. Yeah, I'm glad we could touch on this. Thanks, Brennan. Yeah, I think on one level, eBird is continuing to produce new, for all of those data products we looked at, especially the clean data products. eBird is continuing to incorporate new species there as submission data for those species improves and increases. So that's kind of a very predictable improvement that occurs year over year. But specifically this year, what I'm personally most excited about are some of the updates that are coming to hotspots. And so in spring 2026, there's going to be a big overhaul of hotspots. They are going to be much more kind of user friendly and provide resources for you to kind of plan a whole, birding experience around a particular hotspot. And so what that's going to look like is when you go into these hotspots, you're going to be you can access descriptions, very detailed descriptions of that hotspot, kind of how to navigate it, how to bird it too. There'll be a designated section for specifically how to bird it. So, something like a popka, you could put in there specifically where certain species are tend to be seen, where to be at what time of day to see those species, etc. There's also going to be a whole kind of list of the amenities and facilities that exist at a hotspot, whether that be restrooms or pavilions or paved trails versus more rustic trails or camping or whatever it may be. And a lot of that's actually coming through an integration, or at least expected to come through an integration with All Trails, if you're familiar with that app, which is pretty exciting. And then another thing I'll touch on there is they're also going to kind of restructure how hotspots are grouped together in a way. So right now, you for any given birding destination, say Lake Apopka or Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, you often have kind of one primary hotspot that covers the entire area, and then you have all of these little hotspots that are specific to particular locations within that giant hotspot. And that system makes it kind of difficult to assess the overall bird diversity of a total area, such as, say, Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. And it also creates confusion for observers who are trying to determine, what hotspot do I use when I'm faced with all of these options. And maybe I've traveled, across multiple hotspots within that larger hotspot. I'm not sure how now to like break up my list into different sections. So eBird is going to create a hotspot group essentially where you can look at kind of the collective statistics for all of those hotspots that fall under a parent hotspot, so to speak. So for Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, for instance, all of the data that has been submitted for all of these, child hotspots such as Black Point Wildlife Drive, Peacock's Pocket, whatever, that'll all roll up into a group hotspot where you can see all of that data collected in kind of one place. Or at least that's how it's being conceived. Some of these details haven't fully been worked out yet, but I think that's the most exciting update that I see coming, at least in the near term.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, it's all great. Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Oops, sorry.
Very clear, understandable presentation. Thank you so much.
Very good.
Yeah, it's going to be great on YouTube.
Yeah, no, thank you all. And you see my contact information here. If you ever have a question after the fact that you'd like me to answer, happy to take those. And if also, you're ever curious about reviewing in any of the regions that I review in, feel free to email me, even if it's about a sighting that's, very old and I wasn't the reviewer for, but you were disappointed in how that review outcome turned out. Happy to take a look for you. So thank you all.